Hi. So what I want to do in this video is go over how to find the fast Fourier transform of a signal in MATLAB. And this is important because if you ever run an experiment or you collected data of some sort and you're interested to see what frequency content is present inside of that data, we want to take that data file and perform this FFT function on it in order to determine the content of the frequencies that are present inside of the signal. And I'm going to do a simple example here where we're going to assume we just have this perfect ideal signal that is 6 sine of 4 pi t. I'm going to sample it at 40 hertz, and I'm going to measure it for a total time of 2 seconds. And I'll go through what these mean in more detail in a second. But let's first note and ask ourselves, what do we expect to happen? And in many cases, you don't know what this x of t is. Maybe you have an idea about it, and that can confirm that you're correct. But in some cases, if you're measuring something of an unknown environment, you may not know what frequencies are present. But in this example, I'm giving you what we're measuring, so we know what frequencies are present. So what do we expect to see? Well, let's think about this all in units of hertz. And we know that a sine wave is something like sine omega t. So in this case, omega is equal to 4 pi. That is in units of radians per second. So let's convert that to hertz. We know that omega is equal to 2 pi f. If we were to take that omega and then isolate the f, we get that f is 2. This is in units of hertz, which is implying samples or cycles per second. So if I were to draw a picture of this, we would see that we have 1, 2. I'm going to erase this dashed line. And I'll say that this occurs in 1 second. That's what that means when we say the frequency of the signal. So we have 2 periods in 1 second. We see here that we end up with this type of sine wave. And the 6 here is representing the amplitude of that sine wave. So we see that that is 6. This is -6. The amplitude is measured from the x-axis. So that is the signal that we are measuring, theoretically speaking, if we had an infinite sampling rate. But we have a non-infinite sampling rate. The idea of a sampling frequency is how many samples are we taking per second. Basically, if you think about the sampling frequency like a camera, it is taking pictures and snapshots of that sine wave 40 times in a second. So really what that means is if I were to go ahead and try to replicate the signal, instead of seeing a continuous sine wave, I might see some points that I am sampling at 40 times per second. And I'm running out of space here, but I'm hoping you get the idea that we are not seeing the entire continuous curve. We are seeing discrete data points. So these are sampled points of x of t, which was this function up here. That is what f of s is. And you can go check out my video on aliasing, which is the idea that if we're not sampling fast enough, then this signal will look different due to the fact that we were measuring discrete values of it, and it may look like a lower frequency because of that. So that is what we have as our theoretical signal. Now the question is, what do we expect in our frequency domain? As I showed in another video, if we were to do the FFT of this, we learned that we would have in the frequency domain 2 Dirac delta functions, one at a positive frequency and another at a negative frequency. So I'm looking at F, and I'm looking at the magnitude of x of omega. I would see, considering that our frequency is 2 hertz, I would see some direct delta function at 2, and we will see a mirror image of it on the other side that is negative 2. Because the Fourier transform will spit out both power or content at both positive and negative frequencies. So these are the negative frequencies, and these are the positive frequencies. And you see that it's symmetric about the y-axis. Now the heights, when I say the heights, it's kind of a misnomer because the Dirac delta functions have infinite height, but rather the area underneath each of these curves will be 3 each because of the fact that we split that amplitude of 6 to both positive and negative frequencies. This is what we call a two-sided spectrum because we have 2 sides. We have the positive side and the negative side. This is what we expect to see. So the question is, how do we do that in MATLAB? Well, first off, let's talk about how we create this signal in MATLAB. How do we actually create it? And usually you would have this data recorded. Maybe you have it in some sort of data file. You can import that to MATLAB and then do what you will with it. But for our purposes, we're going to go ahead and create this sampled signal, digitally speaking, ourselves. So let's write down what we would need. Ultimately, we need to have something like this. We would need to have this ultimately, but there's a lot of unknowns here that we need to figure out. And if I want to be really thorough, I can write this as an A, just to generalize it in case we wanted to change what it looks like. And I'll do this in MATLAB after the fact. So in this problem, we know that the amplitude is 6. Again, just hard coding it in case we wanted to change it and make it more robust. We know that our frequency is 2. Again, this is in hertz. This is amplitude. Maybe that unit is volts, or maybe it's velocity, whatever our signal is. And now the more tricky part is, how do we define this time vector? Because we ultimately want it to look like this over here. So we need to have a whole vector of time. And in terms of that, we see that we're going to measure for 2 whole seconds. And I'm sampling at a frequency of 40 hertz. That means I have 40 sampled points per second. So maybe I'll write that down. This is the sampling frequency, which is also in hertz. Oop, I took the G with me. If we think about time, the distance in between these points here, if I were to just look at these 2 points, this is based on how fast we're sampling. If I'm sampling at 1 sample per second, so I have 1, 2, 3, and we're sampling 1 second apart, we know that the distance between those points is 1 second. The distance in between these points ends up being, I'll call this, let's say, the sampling period. This is 1 over the sampling frequency. If we think about units, FS is samples per second. How many samples are we collecting per second? If we take the reciprocal, we get seconds per sample. How much time is in between? And the reason that's important is that if I want to create my time vector, then I have to go ahead and make sure that each discrete point is separated properly. So it's going to be 1 divided by Fs. This is my sampling period. This was in hertz. This was in seconds. Now, our data will start being collected at 0. And then I'm going to increment in, or I'm going to move in increments of TS, the sampling period. And I'm going to go all the way up to the total time, which I didn't define. Let's say that our total time, maybe I can call it, I think I call it T total. That's 2 seconds. Oops. T total. Now, is this correct? Let's think about this for a second. If Fs is 40 hertz, and I collect data for 2 seconds, how many points do I have? Well, if I do 40 samples per second multiplied by 2 seconds, this is just some dimensional analysis to cancel out the points, or the units rather, we end up with 80 samples. What is the size of this matrix currently, the T1? Well, considering that we start at 0, that means that we have included an extra point. So the size of this currently is actually 81 samples because I'm starting at 0. If I started at TS, I don't keep the first point that we measure, then yeah, this would be correct. But however, I'm starting at 0. So in order to have the correct amount of samples, I'm going to subtract that sampling period. Basically saying I'm going to start recording. I'm going to start recording at 0, and now we'll go ahead and sampling every TS seconds. But at 2 seconds, yeah, wish I had a better picture. At 2 seconds, we won't grab that point. We will grab this final point and then say that that is the end of our data set. That 2 second mark would be the start of the next period, which would be in the next set of data possible. So now I have created my signal in MATLAB. This is my X time vector. Cool. We have done that. We can plot it in MATLAB and take a look at what it looks like, and you'll see it looks something like this. Oops, didn't want to erase. It looks something like that up here. We have these discrete points. Granted, in MATLAB, it'll connect the dots by default, but if you were to scatter the data points, you would see it looks like that. So now what? Well, we want to go ahead and look at the Fourier transform of this. And the Fourier transform, let's just say I call it capital X. I'll write it like this, just to signify it's a different variable. This is going to be the FFT of that original signal. And we know that the size of this original signal will be 1 row by 80 samples. Because we collect data for 2 seconds at a sampling frequency of 40 hertz. The algorithm ends up taking these 80 samples and converting it to the frequency domain. And that frequency domain will end up being also 1 by 80. The difference is these are plotted against time. While these are plotted against frequency. So they are inherently different points. Additionally, these 80 points, these are complex. If you remember the definition of the Fourier transform, we took the integral of this x of t and did e to the minus j omega t dt. We see that we have this j here, which means that our x of omega will be complex and have imaginary components to it. So this x that we find in MATLAB will be complex. And just note for, completeness, this is not what is happening inside of MATLAB. This is a theoretical type of computation, assuming that x of t is continuous, but in our case, it's discrete. So we'd have to look at something that's more of a discrete Fourier transform. But for our purposes, this is good enough. I'm not going to go into that. So we have capital X being a complex matrix of 80 elements. Now, ultimately, our goal is to plot frequency versus the magnitude of X, because we would rather see basically what that complex part is doing of the number is dealing with phase within the signal. We're not going to worry about that for our purposes. What we want to do is try to figure out what the amplitude of that sine wave is. So we're going to end up taking the magnitude of that complex number. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit smaller. Still don't know how to work this in perfectly. Okay, good enough. So, to do that in MATLAB, I'm going to go ahead and take the ABS of X. Now, these are all real values. The ABS function, if it was just a typical number, it'll take the absolute value of it, a real number. If X is complex, it will go ahead and take the magnitude of it, which is the square root of the real part squared plus the imaginary part squared. And when we do it of the matrix, every single one of the 80 elements will go through that, and we'll find the magnitude at each of those 8 points. Now, an important thing to note that's a little bit different compared to what we would expect is that when we're doing this algorithm, for proper scaling, of the magnitude or the amplitude, we must divide by the number of points. We're not going to talk about why in this video, but in order to get the proper magnitude, I have to take the original one and divide by n, which is the number of points. I didn't define that, but I can also divide by the length of X. It doesn't have to be the length of capital X. It could be the length of little x, because that's 80. It could be the length of X mag. That's 80. I just chose this. It doesn't matter. But now, this is properly scaled. Perfect. Now, this 80 set of points includes both positive and negative frequencies. So out of the 80 points, both pos and negative content are present. And what's interesting is that we expected a graph ultimately that looked like this. And that is kind of what we'll get, except MATLAB does something really interesting. MATLAB does not output negative frequencies at the correct location, or at the expected location. any negative content is present after the Nyquist frequency. Let's talk about this for a second. So originally, and I'll two different colors here to kind of illustrate this. This is what we expect originally. This is supposed to be 2. This is supposed to be negative 2. This is the theory. In MATLAB, what it does is that instead of plotting, or instead of organizing the FFT output as going from like negative 40 to positive 40 or something like that, it's going to go from 0 to 80. And kind of. It doesn't really go to 80. It goes to 1 less than 80, but we'll talk about that shortly. And what we see is that that blue line will still be a 2. That's correct. But now, instead of having symmetry about the y-axis, we have symmetry about the Nyquist frequency. So this is Fn. Which for this problem, I said negative 40 to 40, it'll be negative 20 to 20, sorry. If we look at this problem, our sampling frequency was 40 hertz. That means that this is 20. That's a Nyquist frequency. We don't expect any frequencies to show up here because any frequencies that are here are aliased down due to the Shannon-Nyquist theorem. We're going to end up aliasing them. So because that space is empty, MATLAB decides, let's go ahead and take our negative frequencies and put them over here, where it is symmetric about that Nyquist frequency. So this corresponds to negative 2. But in the plot, it would show up as 38 because of the fact that it is symmetric about the Nyquist. This is how MATLAB does it. They use this empty space for the negative frequencies. Now, there are functions in MATLAB that can shift this. There's something called FFT shift, which we're not going to talk about. But if you're interested, you can go look that up on your own time. But this is what MATLAB spits out to us. And this is our two-sided spectrum from a computational perspective. So we have now found the magnitudes essentially from 0 all the way up to, and I don't want to say 40. It's not 40. It's going to be 1 less than 40. We'll see why in a second. But I need to now determine what my x vector is if I want to plot it. I have my y vector. That's the x mag. That's been normalized. What is my frequency vector for plotting? In the time domain, we would increment by the sampling period. In the frequency domain, we increment by the frequency resolution. Basically, what is the smallest signal or smallest frequency I can resolve? And it's a really easy definition. df is just 1 over the total time. Because if I am measuring for 2 seconds, what is the lowest frequency that I can fit 1 period into? So if I were to just draw a sine wave, that's 1 period, that is the lowest frequency that we can resolve. If we go smaller than that, well, I can't fit it if my frequency is too low. So if we basically say our total time is like the period of our smallest frequency, we can see that our frequency resolution is just the inverse of the total time. So let's go ahead and define that. df is 1 divided by t total, I think is what I called it. And in this problem, this is 0.5 hertz. So that means we'll have f starting at 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5, and so on. And I'm going to say that my f, and maybe I'll define it as f plot so I don't confuse it with the other f's. This is going to start at 0. We're going to increment by this df. And we're going to go all the way to the sampling frequency. We said before we would go to 40. But what's the issue here? This is the same issue as before with the time vector. If you come up to the time vector, you see that I had to subtract the sampling period in order to have the correct amount of points. I am going to subtract the frequency resolution to ensure I have the correct amount of points. With that defined, I can go ahead and plot f plot x mag, and we'll be good to go. So what I want to do now is go ahead and show you this in MATLAB. And it's just going to be, I'm just going to type the same exact code that we just came up with. We define our t vector and we define our function. We take the FFT, the magnitude of it, which will then scale by the number of points. We'll learn that the plot, it's always in the way. We'll learn that the plot will have positive and negative frequencies, but the negative frequencies will show up as frequencies past the Nyquist frequency. And then we can plot it. We'll set up our frequency vector. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Or let me stop sharing over here. Share screen. Okay. So let's go ahead and do exactly what we just did. I'm just going to pull up my thing. So I know that t total, this was 2 seconds. This was the total time. I know that the amplitude was 6. The frequency was 2. This was sine of 4 times pi times t. F is equal to 2 hertz. The sampling frequency was 40. My sampling period is the reciprocal of that. That's what we just talked about. I'll go ahead and define my time vector. That will go from 0 seconds in increments of the sampling period to t total minus ds, and then I will create the sine wave. If I run this and I look at the size of x, you'll see it's 1 by 80. The size of t is 1 by 80. You can go ahead and look at t. You see that we're incrementing by the sampling period. And we go all the way up to 2 seconds, but 1 sampling period less to ensure we have the correct amount of points. We can plot this just to see what it looks like. It'll be connected, the lines. But you can see that we have this sine wave with a certain amount of periods in it. So now what we want to do is compute the FFT of x. This is going to do a 2-sided one. That's the default. I'm going to take the absolute value of it to find the magnitude. And then I'm going to reassign that magnitude as this normalized and scaled version to get the correct amplitude. That is essentially the y value of my plot. My df is going to be 1 over the total time. I call that t total. And I'll say that my f plot is going to start at 0, go to df. It'll go to ff minus df, as we're going to see all frequencies. If I plot this now, it's going to be frequency on here, hertz, and this is going to be magnitude which is x of omega. I want to make this a little bit bigger so we can see. If we run this, we can see now that we have these two peaks that are present. If I come and click this, you see that at 2 hertz, that's the x value, I have an amplitude of 3. And then at 38, I have an amplitude of 3. If we were to go ahead and plot the Nyquist, let me just do x line fs over 2. So we can see it. Here's the Nyquist. We have symmetry about the Nyquist frequency. This is a two-sided spectrum. I hope that this makes sense. If you have questions, let me know. I'm going to make another video on how to convert this to a one-sided spectrum, but I hope that this is a good start. The idea of defining our signal, which in many cases we won't need to do. If you have data, you would just have this x vector by default from your sensor or what have you. Then you'll go ahead and take the FFT of it. You'll have to take the magnitude of it using the ABS function in MATLAB. You will normalize it by the length of the number of points. If you don't do that, your amplitudes will be wrong. You see here that they are correct. You're splitting that 6 between both 2 and 38, or 2 and -2 hertz. Our frequency resolution is based on what is the lowest frequency we can fit inside of our total acquisition time. So we just look at the period of that time, essentially. We set up our f plot. If we look at the size of f plot, see that that is also 1/80. All the sizes are matching, which allows us to plot it. And we ultimately result in this function here, which shows us that we have frequency content at 2 hertz and -2 hertz. But in MATLAB, it shows up on the other side of the Nyquist frequency. Okay. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay. Thanks. Bye.